I always say that I belong to an endangered species called the China optimist. Regardless of who wins the US presidential election, the pressures on China will increase. Many in the West don't understand the Asian century that is coming. And now I have an opportunity to explain Asia to the world. If there's any one country I'm pro, it's pro-Singapore. Clearly, as you know, in my book, I explain how much I owe to Singapore. But I can also understand why this perception arises in Singapore, because they see me battling all the Western figures. And many of these Western figures are presenting very distorted pictures of China. When you have a major geopolitical contest, it's natural for one side to try and demonize the other side. But we must remember that in this contest, both sides will put their interests first, and both sides will sacrifice the interests of smaller countries like Singapore. So we must make sure that we don't get involved. We do not take sides. But at the same time, if we can do something to minimize the contest and try to explain to both sides, you're better off avoiding this contest. That's what I'm trying to do with my writings. On the one hand, I'm serving Singapore's interests. And on the other hand, the more thoughtful Americans understand very well that I'm trying to help the United States. So the fact that the doors are still open for me in the major American universities show that the thoughtful Americans understand what I'm trying to do. Right now in China, if you talk to businessmen in China, they're clearly not feeling very confident and optimistic about the future. The fact that business sentiment has dampened is not a good sign. The fact that they've allowed a property bubble to emerge and develop in China is not a good sign. Their main challenge is a geopolitical one, dealing with the United States. But the question is whether or not they have the capacity to deal with these challenges. And this is where I think the United States completely underestimates China. It underestimates the ability of the Chinese people and the Chinese government to find pragmatic solutions to their problems. So at the end of the day, it is now conventional wisdom in the West to be pessimistic about China and its prospects. I always say that I belong to an endangered species called the China optimist. And I remain optimistic for China in the long run. Number one, from an understanding of Chinese history. And Chinese civilization has got its cycles. We know that when Chinese civilization goes down, it can go very, very badly down. But then after hitting rock bottom, Chinese civilization would bounce back as it has in the past. So it would be natural for Chinese civilization to have at least another 100 good years, And so far, we've only seen roughly since Deng Xiaoping's modernization program, only 45 years have passed. So we still have some way to go in terms of Chinese civilizational dynamic. And at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party, and this is a point that no Westerner can say, is one of the most meritocratic institutions in the world. And I would say that now, if you want to see, let's say if you want to compare the American government and the Chinese government and the policy makers, I would say the quality of mind of the Chinese policymakers in many cases is better than the quality of mind of American or even European policymakers, partly because, as you know, in China they still find the best people to serve in government. By the way, I want to emphasize one point. Never underestimate the United States. It's a great society. And you must never write off the United States, which is why the US-China contest is so amazing. So in the case of China, United States has got dramatic strengths, especially in the private sector, and China's got dramatic strengths, especially in governance. I have absolutely no doubt that they'll get worse. Because I think there is a rather strong political consensus in Washington, D.C. that the United States has about 10 years to stop China from becoming number one. And Americans believe that it is in their interest to stop China from becoming number one. And I guarantee you that regardless of who wins the US presidential election, the pressures on China will increase. So we should psychologically be ready for a rough road in US-China relations. The big question of our times is whether multilateralism is a sunrise industry or a sunset industry. Superficially, it appears to be a sunset industry because the great powers are ignoring it. And the tragedy here is that it was the United States, together with other Western powers, that created this wonderful range of multilateral institutions. I've written an entire book called The Great Convergence, which explains why they have been unwisely trying to weaken these multilateral institutions. So I actually believe the United States should go back and strengthen multilateralism. And so at the end of the day, at some point in time, the West, which makes up only 12% of the world's population, will understand that it's in their interest to strengthen rather than weaken multilateralism. 100 years ago, in 1924, the European countries and the United States colonized almost every country in the world. Amazing. This small group of people in Europe could control the whole world. Now it's inconceivable, right? The power of the West has diminished. Simultaneously, you're seeing the emergence of the biggest geopolitical contest ever seen in human history. That's the one between the United States and China. So can you imagine a world where we are dealing with so many changes, and then multilateral institutions got to survive in the midst of this change? Which is why actually I feel very fortunate that I'm alive today to see such massive changes. And the reason why I'm writing these books is that I want the future historians to understand that this was an era of exceptional change. As I try to explain in my latest book, the 21st century will be the Asian century. Unfortunately, even though the economic power is shifting to Asia, the cultural power still remains solidly in the West. And many in the West don't understand the Asian century that is coming. And they're looking for people who can explain the nature of this Asian century. But I've had the great privilege of being able to learn and study Asia all my life. And now I have an opportunity to explain Asia to the world. I think overall, there is no question that China has become stronger under President Xi Jinping. In fact, as you know, in my book, Has China Won?, I was unusually candid in saying that when President Xi Jinping took office and became head of the Chinese Communist Party, he was put in a difficult position of having to kill two monsters that could have destroyed the Chinese Communist Party. The first monster was factionalism, and that's why you almost had a coup carried out by Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang against the Chinese Communist Party. And the second monster was corruption. So he decided that to save China and the Chinese Communist Party, he had to destroy these two monsters. And by the way, it takes a tremendous amount of political will and courage to destroy such big political monsters. And for that, of course, he's also subject to a lot of criticisms. But at the same time, during his time in office, the pressure by the United States on China has grown by leaps and bounds. If he had been a weak leader, he could have buckled. China could have buckled, but he hasn't. And what's striking is that even though the Anglo-Saxon media is very negative on President Xi Jinping, they almost don't have a good word to say about him. But you notice that when the third world leaders, the leaders of the global south, see him, they treat him with enormous respect, And even today, if you look at the Europeans still travel to China. And interestingly enough, Prime Minister Meloni, even though she pulled out Italy out of the Belt and Road Initiative, is still going to China. So that's a sign that countries around the world recognize and respect the leadership of President Xi Jinping.